How's everyone doing? Welcome back to another episode of The Banker Next Door. I am your host, Dr. Joe Berquist. Today, in the 200th episode of The Banker Next Door, it's a great little milestone there. I wanted to talk about check fraud and basically paper checks. Are paper checks still used? Would banks like to find an alternative to them? Can they find an alternative to them? What is still like, why do people still like to use checks? We're going to get into kind of all that as we kind of look at a few articles here today. We're going to look at a recent article from the ABA Banking Journal, which was titled, "Is It Time to Kill the Paper Check?" And then we're also going to look at a more recent article from the Business Journals called "Big Brands Are Ditching Paper Checks. Small Business Owners Might Not Be Able to Do the Same." But to kick us off here, I want to read a little blog post from Naomi Snyder, who is the editor-in-chief for Bank Director, and this is titled, "Who Can Afford Check Fraud?" So, an acquaintance runs a small business with her husband in Nashville, Tennessee. She was shocked to learn recently that their business's checks had been forged, and the criminals had written a bunch of fat checks from the couple's operating account. When she went to the bank to report the fraud, the banker on the phone, who represented an institution with more than $500 billion in assets, balked at reimbursing the funds. "We can't afford this," the banker said. "My acquaintance didn't feel like they could afford it either. Eventually, the bank concluded an investigation and reimbursed the couple for the losses. Still, unnerved by the experience, they took their banking elsewhere." Check fraud has been on the rise. Despite fewer Americans writing checks these days, customers aren't the only ones feeling stressed. More than 90% of the 471 bankers responding to this week's IntraFi's survey said check fraud rose in the past 2 to 3 years. More than one quarter reported check fraud was up more than 50%. That has real costs. The 2023 Federal Reserve Financial Services Financial Institution Risk Officer Survey found that check fraud represents 31% of fraud losses in the prior 12 months, second only to debit card fraud at 35%. Not only that, banks are struggling to get reimbursed. The business of checking has a responsibility matrix that depends on the type of fraud involved. Sometimes the depositor bank is on the hook for the fraud. Sometimes the bank that issued the checks is, says Sam Truitt, senior analyst for financial crimes at Jack Henry and Associates. But in IntraFi's survey, 49% reported delays were common in repayments for bad checks, with most of those naming mega banks as the most likely to cause difficulties in repayment. Whoever is at fault, pointing fingers isn't going to solve this problem. The industry needs better tracking and enforcement mechanisms instead. So, very interesting there. I wanted to point that out because obviously check fraud is a major thing in banking. It is the second largest fraud, as you saw there, 31%. All fraud being bank fraud, second only to debit card fraud. So so check fraud's a major thing in banking. It really exploded over the last couple of years. And small business owners, unfortunately, are the ones that get hit with the with the bulk of this, where they will get a number of checks forged, and then somebody will try to take that over and deposit it into another bank and basically try to get as much money out of them as they can. So but does that mean that checks are necessarily unsecure? So that we'll kind of explore that here in a few minutes. But like I said, I wanted to read this just to kind of start off, just to give it an overview as to where we're at. The kind of interesting comment there at the end is like the industry needs better tracking and enforcement mechanisms instead. And I think the problem with that is that that's easier said than done. I think that's the issue there. So I wanted to read that there to kind of set the stage here. But now let's go into a couple of these articles here. So this is called is it time to kill the paper check? Checks aren't dying on their own. Meanwhile, check fraud is up exponentially while bankers await a killer app for payments. And and I kind of laugh at this. I have to say that I kind of laugh at this a little bit. But this idea that like some kind of a payment app or a payment channel, or like just using debit and credit cards more, is somehow going to fix the problem. I mean, you saw that. I just read that the number one fraud is debit card fraud at 35%. Credit card frauds, getting your credit cards hacked, identity theft. I mean, these are all major types of theft and fraud that are out there. And, and this kind of, I think some bankers or the industry has this kind of notion that like, oh, if we just get rid of checks completely, that'll just take care of like all the problem and we'll be fine. And oh, by the way, that there's just better and more secure ways of sending your money than using a check. And a check is still, even though, like I said, a lot of people view it as like, oh, it's a dinosaur. It's a dinosaur using a check. No, you're not a dinosaur if you use a check. A check is still a very good and reliable way of sending payments. All right, so let's get into this article here. So it says here, the Federal Reserve's massive check clearing infrastructure was largely made obsolete by the 2003 Check 21 Act. For routine transactions, checks have become so marginal that the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Payment Choices relegates them to a category of other, which along with prepaid cards and money orders accounts for less than 9% of all payments in 2022. But contrary to a 2023 Washington Post report, checks aren't entirely dead. While the volume of checks written each year has fallen from 50 billion in 1995, it was still at 11.2 billion in 2021. For high-value payments, checks are often a preferred choice. They are the second most common form of payments over $500, notes ABA EVP Paul Benda. Sorry about that. Accounting for 43% of payments to contractors, 35% of gifts to charity, and 27% of payments to government entities. Although checks have declined in use for payments, their use by criminals as a vector of fraud has shot up. In 2022, financial institutions filed 680,000 suspicious activity reports, or SARS, related to check fraud with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, up more than 700% in less than a decade. Checks account for less than 9% of payments, but 66% of payment fraud, according to the Association of Fraud Professionals. And if the criminals are able to get away with it, the fraud loss is usually eaten by the financial institutions and ultimately by customers in the form of higher costs for credit and payment services, which raises the question: the paper check won't die. Is it time to kill it? So then they go on to say, what's the problem of checks? So checks are an inherently secure form of payment. Like I said, yes, they are. Who would ever give a random person their name, address, bank account number, and routing number to someone on the street? But we still do it for some reason. There's truth in that, but there's also who would ever give to a random person? I don't think most people are giving their checks to just a random person. I think most people, like it said here, 43% of payments to contractors, 35% to charity, and then 27% of payments to government entities. So, I mean, like you pay your taxes, it's like, so is the government a stranger on the street? I would like to think most of the contractors that you use, you're probably going to know who they are. They're probably local people. So there's hopefully a little bit of a trust factor there. And then 35%, of course, given to charities. It's like, so if you're given the same charity all the time, like that, is that really dangerous? So I give it to a lot of charities all the time. Still write them checks, all the time. So, but anyway, people always thought checks were safe, that putting them in the mail was safe, notes Luana Cundiff, president and CEO of First State Bank of St. Charles in St. Charles, Missouri. That's not true anymore. They're not as safe and secure as average Americans once thought. The presence of this and other data on a document that can be altered or watched is one reason check fraud continues to skyrocket. So, and again, this this is like, yeah, this is true. Do we have so in other words, I think what she's alluding to there is that basically checks can get stolen out of the mail, and then the check gets stolen out of the mail, and then they can basically alter it or wash it to create a kind of a duplicate check. But here's what I would say here. This is not your check fraud is not perpetrated by your common everyday criminal. Like it is not. There is a little bit more skill involved in perpetrating check fraud, and I think. And businesses are the ones that get a lot of that, and you'll kind of see this in a second here as we continue down. But I think that most of the time for banks, what they find out is when a customer, when a business customer does have the check fraud, that it's usually some type of an inside job. It's usually a disgruntled employee or a former employee. Somebody got a hold of their checks and then like you said, altered or washed them, and then they get a check with their signature on it, get a copy of that, and then go out and then duplicate, scan the check and do the things that they do to create a duplicate check. And part of this too also goes back to training for bank employees. Bank employees need to be able to look at checks and determine if is this a real check or not? Is this a legitimate check or not? So, so again, part of this falls on the bank too for making sure that the employees and the tellers and your customer service people are properly trained to be able to tell when a check is fraudulent or not. And I think a lot of banks do a very good job with that. And I think they do catch a lot of stuff. So going on here, so checks are expensive for both banks and business clients. The median cost to issue paper checks hovers around $2 to $4 a piece, while the cost to receive them runs about $1 to $2 per check, according to an Association of Financial Professionals survey. Cost to send and receive ACH transactions come in at less than 50 cents per transaction. It also requires expensive imaging and processing equipment on the bank side. Okay, that's all nice and good, but I mean, if do you know what a pain it is to set up an ACH transaction? Like it's like, that's not always, especially if you're a business, like setting up an ACH. And then if it's only a one-time payment, do I want to go through the hassle of setting up ACHs to send a one-time check for $1,000? Like, I don't know if that really works. Cundiff notes that today, the check clearing process is a lot more efficient than it was before Check 21, and the cost has gone way down. But when you consider the fraud costs on top of it, particularly in the last year to year and a half, it's not going to be a cost-effective alternative by any stretch. While the volume of checks written each year has fallen, it was still at 11.2 billion in 2021. For high-value payments, checks are often a preferred choice. They are the second most common form of payment over $500. And now here we get into the persistence of checks. Regardless of the risk, a check is still the easiest way to transfer a large amount of money for no added fee. That's the absolute thing right there. The recipient pays no interchange as it would with a debit or credit card, and customers aren't limited to transaction amount caps banks often have for cards and other transactions. There's no need to set up an ACH. In fact, ACH is basically the inverse of checks convenience, like what I just said. A paper check is more cumbersome for payees, though it puts the payer's data at risk, while ACH requires payees to do less to receive the payment, though they must disclose account information. I think so. I think there's a lot there. Checks are, again, like you're writing the information out, but if you need to send a large payment, if you need to send $10,000, $50,000, $60,000, whatever, just write the check out, send it off. There's no, like I said, there's no interchange fee. It's fast. You don't have to go through the hassle of setting up an ACH and that kind of thing. So now let's go down here. So, what might replace checks? So given checks' continued ease of use, is there a single financial solution that can provide similar or greater convenience and protection? So checklist checking products have been around for a long time. In fact, the Bank on National Account Standards encompass checklist products as something that still meets basic financial inclusion needs. But there's a long way to go before checklist accounts are universal. Are wire transfers a suitable substitute for checks for high value payments? Some banks have removed fees for domestic wires, making them competitive in cost to checks, and a wire eliminates the risk of fraud from a check being stolen and altered. However, as ABA SVP Nessa Fields notes, the consumer protection rules for electronic transactions like debit card and ACH transactions and those for wire transfers are different, correct? And again, it gets back to it, and it also gets back to a convenience thing. Like, okay, when wire fraud is also a very big thing, and and banks have a lot of there's a lot of rules and procedures you got to follow to go and send out a wire. It's not, you can't just let me just hop online and send a wire out. Like, no, it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't work like that. So then it just say is like, what thus While there are protections against unauthorized transferred under both laws, they are different, and it can require a sophisticated consumer to understand the difference in the payment rails. So this goes on to say, making the best of paper checks. In the absence of a killer app to replace paper checks, there are still several things that bankers can do to mitigate the risk of fraud. More and more banks are realizing that implementing technology to uncover fraudulent transactions is a good use of dollars. Another thing is encouraging their client base to take responsibility for reviewing their statement more often than once a month by the use of additional technologies such as positive pay. Yeah, positive pay is a fantastic thing. Like if you are a small business owner, you don't have positive pay, if you've never used positive pay, definitely ask your bank about it. I mean, there is a cost for it, like with anything else. I mean, there is a cost to use positive pay, but it is a fantastic system and it works really well. And it will, like I said, it will catch fraudulent checks. It will catch stuff that because you're putting all your information into it. Like positive pay, you put all your information in, like you write out a check, you put it in there. So if a check pops up that you haven't written out, or nothing's in there, it's gonna hold that check, and it's gonna basically require you to go in, log into the system. You'll get a notice that you log into the system, and basically you can either say, oh yeah, I want to pay that, maybe you forgot to put the information in, or you could say, oh no, that you could waive it as fraud and say, no, that's a fraudulent check, stop that. And so yeah, positive pay is a great system if you haven't had out there. And it says in here, like, positive pay adds an extra step and thus a little friction in the payment process, but it provides a key safeguard against a fraudulent check being paid. For business clients that are reluctant to take that extra step, some banks are requiring that they sign an indemnification agreement if they waive the use of positive pay. Others may require business clients to use it should there be a fraudulent check drawn on their account. So is positive pay fit for consumer accounts? Unlikely. Yeah, because Brendan notes that consumers most likely to use paper checks, often senior clients, are least likely to be tech savvy enough to approve checks digitally. Positive pay could be interesting for consumers. I think it might be something, but I don't know if it's cost effective for consumers, honestly. And then let's see, and then it wraps up by saying small steps. So bankers say that it may not be realistic to kill the paper check in the short term, in part because banks continue to invest a lot in helping the system work better for clients. Okay, then let's very quickly take a look at this other article here called "Big Brands Are Ditching Paper Checks. Small Business Owners Might Not Be Able to Do the Same." So Target Corp stopped accepting personal checks for customer purchases earlier this month, joining the ranks of big businesses that have ditched the old school payment method. It's a lineup that includes the likes of Whole Foods, Aldi, and Old Navy, all of whom have canceled checks as a payment option. At the same time, digital payments through the likes of Venmo, Cash App, and other card and phone-based systems have skyrocketed. For small business owners in particular, does the changing tide of consumer payment system mean it's time to stop taking checks? It's premature for most business owners to fully phase out paper checks, said Ed Newman, Chief Financial Officer of business-to-business financial technology company VersaPay. Massive organizations like Target may have the buying power to stop accepting checks, but that's simply not the reality for the vast majority of businesses. The numbers bear out how checks will still account for a large amount of payments despite their massive drop in use. And then it goes over some of the numbers that we mentioned in the previous article. And it basically says this translates to an average value of check payments increasing over that time period, rising from $1,600 in 2015 to $2,400 in 2021. A VersaPay study found that 87% of financial leaders believe their customers are ready to make payments digitally and move away from paper checks, while 40% of CFOs surveyed say that they are seeing paper checks used less often. Newman said many business partners and customers are looking for companies that have a variety of payments, including easier digital payments, and they would make a switch if making payments were easier. He said alternatives can be found in the form of virtual credit cards and e-checks, but ultimately businesses need to approach this by weighing both what makes their customers' lives easier and how they can optimize payment acceptance for themselves. He said ceasing to accept paper checks is a luxury that most businesses do not have. And then it says, and it goes into kind of like drawback use of checks. There are certain drawbacks to using checks. Among these concerns is check fraud. Okay. And then it basically just talks more about check there. So it's like, so basically, checks, for better or worse right now, remain a necessary evil. I think the the bottom line is that, we still have, check fraud is a massive issue in the banking business. But because of still the easy use of checks, the fact that it makes it easy for you to send larger amounts of money to different customers and things like that, to the government, to pay taxes and things of that nature, it's just not realistic that paper checks are going to go away anytime soon. I mean, you still have 11 billion checks written every year with a B. 11 billion. It's not like, I mean, if it was 11 million, that might be one thing, but 11 billion checks is still a lot of checks that are out there and being used. And and again, I know there's a lot of surveys and there's a lot of things out there that basically say like, oh, it's just old people using checks, and the younger generation doesn't really want them and that kind of stuff. Like it's still a huge thing for businesses, though. I mean, businesses got to have it. I still think there are a lot of consumers out there that still like using checks all the time and do use checks all the time. And so unfortunately, for better or for worse, I think that I agree with, if we go back to what Naomi Snyder said at the beginning in her little blog post, the industry needs to, better tracking and enforcement mechanisms, like, using positive pay, using other security type systems out there. I think that's a great way to help cut down on a lot of this stuff. Obviously, educating consumers and educating your bank employees as to the effects of check fraud, how to prevent check fraud, all that kind of stuff. That will obviously go a long way as well. But there you have it. So obviously, so like I said, hopefully people got a little something out of this. I hope that if there's some small business owners that are out there watching this episode today, I hope that this helps a little bit, and definitely go ask your bank about positive pay if you've never heard of it, or, it would be interested in inquiring about that service from them. So I hope you go check that out. But I will wrap up with this. If you like this episode, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as that always helps the channel. Please make sure to leave your comments down below. Remember, we are on YouTube, Rumble, and all major podcast platforms. And I will see everybody again real soon. Thanks a lot.